Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the final days of our exhibition, Home Front Heroines, which closes this Sunday. We're very pleased to have Dianne Bardsley here to join us for a special talk about land girls in Aotearoa. So throughout the 1990s, Dianne travelled across New Zealand to trace and interview women who served in the Women's Land Service during World War II. So although she had found meagre official records in the National Archives and in the National Library, with the help of a retired wartime land girl, Joan Butland, she managed to actually find and interview 220 women in person and many more in written interviews. Her book, The Land Girls in a Man's World, 1939 to 1946, was published by Otago University Press in 2000 and was reprinted in the same year. So pretty popular. With a rural background, Dianne has been a secondary school teacher and a university lecturer. She has a PhD in applied linguistics, from which the book In the Paddock and On the Run describes the uniqueness and historical significance of New Zealand's form of rural language. Dianne has travelled all the way from the Wairarapa to be here tonight, so please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Thank you for that introduction. Nothing to do with land girls has been arduous for me, I have to say. It's been an absolute joy. Can you all hear me well enough?
Yes.
Good. Well, everybody's going to want to know, why on earth did you do this? You were a secondary school teacher. Why? And it's because I was growing up I came from a sheep and beef property in the Wairarapa, and people would talk about land girls and people who had land girls, and it was most interesting. And I could hear these girls. I have to say, it's in the 1940s, and I could hear my parents saying, oh, well, they had land girls. And, well, she was a land girl. And it was obvious that the way they spoke, that intonation, that these were special women, as well as knowing a few who came post-war in the Wairarapa. And through my work as a teacher of English, well, head of department, dean, etc., I was working with literature for senior students that had nothing to do with New Zealand. It had very little to do with New Zealand history. And I would ask a question. We might be reading Janet Frame, one of Janet Frame's, one of her biographies, one of her autobiographies, and An Angel at My Table, and we'd come across snapdragons. And one of the things you have to do as a teacher is to predict the questions that will be asked. And so I would say, what's a snapdragon? And of course, they didn't know, or I'd say, what's another word for snapdragon? And they wouldn't know, but they'd never ask the question. They'd sort of just read on. And so, and it was the same with with their affiliation with native trees. They didn't know them. They didn't know anything about them, where they grew in New Zealand, any of the characteristics. And, you know, I was teaching English, but it seemed to me that we needed some literature that was New Zealand based. So I wrote and researched the land girls and boys who had gone off, who made choices and who came home after the Second World War. And so I had two plays that were used in secondary schools throughout New Zealand. One was just simply called Land Girls, and one Glory Boys. And they shared a scene, part of which came from my imagination, but part of which was told to me by a man who I met when I was looking at a collection of wartime art, wartime paintings in Wellington. And he was looking very intently at Casino. And I said, I have a feeling that you might have been there. And he said, I was. And I said, well, obviously in the army, and he said, I was. He said, but you know, I lived in Karori, we were students, and he said we were sitting around and it looked as if it was time that we really had to go. And so there were 4 or 5 of us sitting there. And he said, one of us said, oh, well, I'll go to the army. I know it was me, that was him. Oh, well, I'll do Navy, I'll do Air Force. And the sister who was there said, I'll be a land girl. And this was not until about 1942. So they were quite young, they really were quite young. So that's how this came to be. And because I've been a teacher, I'm going to actually tell you a few things about the cover, which you might find strange. I'll start with the photo of Grace. Grace was, yes, she was a blade shearer. She grew up on Derville Island. Her father had a property, a farm at Greville Harbour. There was no electricity, and she did all the things that her father did from the age of about 9. She first started crutching when she was 9. And she, when she was 21, her 21st birthday, she was actually out land girling on the mainland, and she shore 150 mixed breed ewes in 115 blade shore in one day, and that was the female blade shearing record for New Zealand. She went on to have quite an illustrious career as a rural farmer herself and had children, but it was too late for me to interview her, unfortunately, but she's worth researching. Now, the land girls as such, you might think, well, why didn't I call it the Women's Land Service? The land girls was the safest thing for me to call this book, because in 1939, the 2nd of September, when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, much to Britain's consternation, everybody in the world realised, especially those in support of Britain and Europe, realised that it was going to be a full war, and that lots of farming and production was going to be lost with men going overseas. So there was call for a land army, and so immediately, informally, people started going to farms, forming a land army. Then, in 1941, Commander Boyle, who lived at Urari, had some land, a property called Whipsnade. He had been in the Navy, he was English, and he'd been in the Navy in the First World War. And he realised that the push for food was going to be immense. So he started a training school on the farm for women. He realised that a land corps was needed. So that's when the land army became the land corps. And it didn't become the Women's Land Service officially until 1942, when Mary Grigg, your MP at that time for Mid-Canterbury, got busy and toured New Zealand with Mary Drever, who was a Labour woman MP, and recruited the women to help on the farm. So, I mean, there's actually quite a bit to finding what I was going to call this book and finding a photograph, an appropriate photograph. These are just some ads that appeared in the Journal of Agriculture about that time. More horses were wanted. People were asked to breed horses on their properties because trucks were commandeered by the army, farm trucks. And not only farm trucks, but horses and rifles. So there was the girls had quite a lot less to work with on farms at that time. Now, why were we short of some particular things? what we had to do, which we hadn't ever done before in a big way, was to grow linen flax. And this was wanted for the Air Force, for parachutes, etc. And so there was a tremendous amount of flax grown. There was a big flax factory at Methven. I don't know if people still know about the history of that place. I haven't been there. Obviously, butterfat. So there was the linen flax, as well as that there was wheat. There were oats that had to be grown, and this was after 28,000 men left the rural sector and had no replacements. There were no replacements. And gradually, women did move in. So you had our butter, our cheese, our beef, our mutton, our wool, our potatoes and other vegetables that weren't too perishable that could go to the Pacific. All of these reached record production during the Second World War. So when the need was there, it could be provided. But this, nobody really realised after the war that this work was done by these women, and there were fewer rifles, so the rabbits proliferated. There weren't women who could actually wave a slasher about, and the gorse proliferated. So there were difficulties that they actually had at that time. Please stop me anytime and ask a question which you think tells you more than what I've really said or described. And of course there was pork too, and our production of bacon and ham was sent over. We were really Britain's overseas farm to a greater extent than ever before. Now, this was a photograph of two city girls who went separately to a property in the North Island, and it was used to attract women to land girling. And of course it looks superb. It looks trouble-free. It looks as if you don't need to be particularly fit. You'll just have a horse and you'll be fine. It wasn't like that. And interestingly, there was a tremendous opposition to the call for women. And it came from what was the Farmers' Union, and now, of course, the Federated Farmers. And it came from women, and it came from politicians. Now, the Farmers' Union felt that women would be useless, that they wouldn't be strong enough. And we've got some people here tonight whose mother used to say that she could do anything the men could do, and as quickly or as well. And I can believe that. These girls were so determined. So there was a lot of opposition. Now, it was surprising that there was so much opposition from the women. The women who were married to farmers did not like cooking for other women, and it was quite strong and quite widespread, that attitude. And they didn't want their husbands to be working with these girls out on the hills and the sheds, etc. Because it was a very different world then. Women were domiciled in the kitchen and in the home. They didn't go beyond the garden fence, really. They didn't have anything to do with stock. And there was strong opposition from politicians, and it wasn't until Mary Grigg became your Member of Parliament here in 1941, after her husband, who was the MP, Major Arthur Grigg, was killed overseas. So women were not going to be welcomed with open arms everywhere. There were some basic uniform provisions. They were given just a service uniform. I don't know if you've all been downstairs to see the very nice dress uniform that the girls had. It was a beautiful wool, chocolate brown. It was delightful, and their hats were very stylish, very nice. And I'll show you some photos of Mary Drever and Mary Grigg, who actually wore these uniforms as they went around the country recruiting girls. So it was pretty basic, and in those days, some of the girls, they had to do their own washing. They had, and often had to get water from troughs, and they had just cold water to wash their overalls, etc. It wasn't as if there were washing machines then. There were no washing machines. And it's the same with everything else, really, that they wore. They did have some, as well as boots, they were given some very nice leather boots, also some gum boots. And the girls who were working in dairy sheds had clogs, and wooden clogs. And I'm not quite sure what the idea was about wooden clogs, but they found that very often the cows were frightened by the noise of the clogs, because there was concrete in those days, and they were noisy. And just 3 pairs of socks. But the ads went out. They can do the job. They can. And so there were these photographs of, women doing all sorts of things outside. The push was very strong, because by 1942, it was very serious that we hadn't been producing enough food to send anywhere. And of course, later on in the war, we had to feed the US servicemen as well. But not just those in the Pacific, but those who were here. And all the time, there was rationing during this time. Now, I think Mid-Canterbury is very, very significant in the history of the land girls, starting with Commander Boyle, whom I've already mentioned. He set up that training program, and those girls went on to help train others. There was this very short course at Lincoln University at one stage, and the girls went there for, I think, 6 weeks. But that was just a small number of girls. It was something like under 30. And so there was no training given, and yet these girls were expected to land on a property, to be able to work dogs, to be able to ride a horse, to know how to milk a cow, where you got the milk from. And it wasn't easy for them. A lot of the farmers would say, well, we're going to crutch tomorrow, and they wouldn't know what crutching was and what their role was. And so they were told what to do, but they weren't told how to do it. And this was repeated time and time again at interviews, that there was not enough, there was no instruction as such. And then, of course, Mary Grigg was very important. She was important, I suppose, in history, because she was the first national MP, woman MP in New Zealand. She was also important because she was the granddaughter of Sir John Hall, who nurtured the suffrage bill through Parliament. And she was quite significant because she was married to a Long Beach Grigg, and they were quite significant in their breeding, their exporting, etc. And through all the work that she and Mary Drever did, the Land Service was formed. And I find that quite interesting, that there were not 2 men from opposite sides of the house who went out recruiting for anything. Now, in 1942, you probably realise that these girls were man-powered, and they would be man-powered, had a choice usually of factory work, and that was very often jam factories, was all the time preserving food, etc., saving food. So jam factories were often offered. There were armament factories in New Zealand. They also could go to what was known then as mental hospitals, or they could become land girls. Now, a lot of these girls were doing, in those days, very feminine things. You wouldn't have women accountants, for example. You probably didn't have many. You had some women lawyers, but not a lot. And so they weren't professional women. They came from hairdressing. They were training as hairdressers. They were training as beauticians. They were from the cities. I would have a continual story that was repeated from so many girls who said, well, they were in their 80s, of course, when I interviewed them, who said, I left on a train, a night train. I left Wellington at 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock or whatever. And I got to Aotearoa at 3 a.m. And I was dropped off at the station. Nobody was there. Then a farmer arrived in an old truck, and he said, are you the land girl? And she would say yes, and they drove for miles and miles. This girl claimed it was more than 30 miles, on a metal road in the night, and then he was told, well, you'll be up at 5. And so she had no time to go to bed. Now, this particular girl, this poor girl, and this is an oft-repeated story, she left after 6 months because she was out there with him. He was very aggressive. He was violent to his stock, and she really felt that her life could be in danger. So she walked to the neighbours, and they helped her, and went back and collected her clothes, what she had, and she left. She's gone on to have a highly successful life, but at times, well, there was a time in her life when we could have lost her. Now, I don't know if many of you know of Liz Richards at Rakaia. She was a farmer in her own right, and she also trained land girls. When I went to see her, she was very interesting. She was the only person that never offered a cup of tea, whatever time you arrived. She'd never offer a cup of tea. Well, I've got a truck coming shortly to pick up some cows, or I've got a this or a that. And so I said, shall I come back tomorrow? Well, no, tomorrow's not going to be any better because I'm doing whatever. And she was an incredibly dedicated farmer. And she had a few problems up there. It was not easy farming. She was right at the end of the Rakaia Gorge, this end. Now this is Mary Grigg and Mary Drever. They look fairly amiable. They look as if they're getting on pretty well. I have to say that the uniforms didn't look quite like that on these dashing young women when they go to town. I know that Joyce Greaves' family are here, and I'll never forget Joyce telling me that she didn't go to town for 2.5 years. She didn't go off the property. It was a massive property anyway, and that's what her life was like for 2.5 years. So she never had a chance until the end to wear her dress uniform. This is the kind of ad that was out once Mary and Mary did their thing around the country, around the nation. I particularly liked this photo because everybody was playing their part. One of the boys and family had joined the Navy. The daughter at the back was in the Women's Land Service. The other brother was in the Air Force. Dad had been in the First World War. Well, he was in the army, and he would go regularly to train young men. And Mum was holding the fort and keeping the show on the road, so to speak. And that's the role that women and men played. Some of you have probably heard or seen of a film called The Land Girls, which was about British land girls. And it was quite a different service. It sprang really from the experience that was in Britain in the First World War of women going out and growing vegetables and, you know, even taking over churchyards and areas, tennis courts and, you know, lawn tennis, etc., where they just grew vegetables for the troops. And from that, they decided that they would do a more established land army during the Second World War. Now, in that time, the girls went into a hostel and they were trained. They never went to a farm alone. There were always at least two of them. They never had to ride a horse. They didn't have to provide their own dogs. They didn't have to do any of that sort of thing that our girls did. They didn't have to do snow raking. Of course, in Britain, it wasn't a lot. There weren't a lot of sheep. It was mainly, they were doing mainly orcharding and dairying. So they never actually cut the throats of sheep. Cutting the throats of sheep was fairly controversial, and there was a politician who said, girls who can cut the throats of sheep are not going to make future mothers of the nation. And that was quite, for him, it was quite a compelling argument because, you know, people who were with him, the cronies, the gronies, they agreed. So it was unique. They didn't just have to cut the throats of the sheep. And in those days, and just after the war, and I remember doing this at home, we had to pluck the wool from the dead sheep, and we would spend a lot of time plucking dead sheep, and it was a most unpleasant job. And then we had to dig the hole and bury them. And there were girls who were supposed to bury dead cows. And so they sort of thought, right, okay, started digging, looked at each other and said, well, why don't we do something else? And they lit the carcass, had been there a while, and burned it. But before they got very far, all these rats came out. The rats were coming every direction out of the carcass. They had to stitch up burying ewes who'd had a prolapse during lambing, and these ewes were saved, and so the uterus was pushed back in and stitched, and one poor girl had got the poor distressed ewe up against a fence and happily sewed along, but then realised that she'd actually sewn it to the wire on the fence. And fences were quite useful for girls. For example, in those days too, you skinned the sheep. And just really disposed of the guts. And these girls would have to skin these jolly sheep. And they would be teased like mad because there'd be holes in the sheep. And there's one girl who was teased. She said, I knew what would happen. Everybody was going to tease me about this skin because it had so many holes in it. And she said, so I buried it. And the next day, someone had seen it, noticed it, and dug it up and put it over the fence. And she said it was just like embroidery, and they all called it Thelma's embroidery. Now there were two women here in mid-Canterbury, the Guinness girls, who lived at Ealing, and they did a lot of things on that farm. It was, for example, a very mixed farm. It was dairying, and they had sheep as well. And part of the problem, as you all know, in the summer, is that a lot of land becomes summer dry, and these sheep would have to be taken, driven. There were no trucks that could take them. So the girls drove them with their dogs on their horseback over to roads, over to properties that they'd never been to before, in the hills. And very often they'd have to make sure they'd stop and ask somebody, are we going to so-and-so, and try and hold 300 ewes together. And once they, going over the Rangitata River bridge, one ewe decided she'd had enough and she died. She just fell down and died, and they had to drag her to the end. They claimed it was right in the middle. And these girls worked really hard because they did all the hay work in those days, the cutting of the hay and the thatching, and they built haystacks. They didn't, there was no hay baler in those days. And as well as that, they helped with dairying. And people would say to them, well, you know, your father, you're working for your father, you'll be fine. And they claimed that their father was so hard on them and expected such a high standard that he didn't expect from anybody else. So there was a lot of effort that went into keeping our farm's production up. So it's just a photo of snow raking. There were 3 successive winters where girls around Fairlie were out snow raking. And very often the fences would be in a mess afterwards. There were tremendous losses in sheep and lambs particularly. And it was a job they hated. And it was Joyce Grieve who really hated snow raking. Now this is one of the girls, not from mid-Canterbury. She was actually from Queenstown, from Elfin Bay. And this was a mustering hut. She did all the mustering on this property. She was at Greenstone Station and Elfin Bay Station. And that's where she would live at least overnight. But the girls did live in corrugated iron whares. And it was just cold water. The huts themselves were unlined. Do you know what they're doing? Priming the windmill, because they would have no water unless the windmill was primed. This woman, Joan Hargraves, who was a real character, having a bath, and the bath was actually made of wood. It was a wooden bath, and it was in the cowshed. That's her bath. That's as far in as she could get. The deer proliferated as well as rabbits. And this is her sister. The sister of the girl at Elfin Bay, who went shooting deer. She had good hunting dogs. Those girls did some tremendous work. Juliet Peter did a lot of sketching when she wasn't working. And there was a lovely woman there she came from Canterbury. By the time I met her, she was in Governor's Bay, retired, of course. And she was a scream. She was into everything that there was to be fun. So she would strip her clothes off and put them on the fence and get a suntan, which we all felt we could do in the 1940s and 50s without any hassle. She also went along to the Plunket Society baby competition, and she took her pup and was dressed in baby clothes and she was in her land girl uniform, her dress uniform, doing mischievous, fun things like that. They had to do a lot of that because a lot of these girls had fiancés, boyfriends, brothers, fathers overseas, and a lot of them didn't hear from them for months on end and had no idea whether they were actually still alive. So they were a plucky group. Now this is Ada Coates, and she was the sister of Joseph Coates, and he was a Prime Minister at one stage in New Zealand, and they lived in the far north in the Bay of Islands, and she went to school. She rowed a boat to school. She had an amazing life. She was 54 when she joined the Land Girls. She was the oldest Land Girl recruit. She also rode side saddle, as you can see, and she continued to do that until she died. Quite a woman. This is a Juliet Peter oil. I actually have the cartoon of that, which was done in watercolours at home. Now, at the moment, I went at the weekend to Christchurch Gallery, the new lovely gallery, and they had fridge magnets of land girls from the Second World War of this painting. So I couldn't resist buying one. I thought, well, I'll take that home. That will flatter my fridge no end. So are there any questions? Because I'm out of my slides, and I realised that because I was angling this more to this area, there are lots of photos that I didn't bring. Lots of photos of draft horses, four-horse teams, which we used to do the harvesting. I mean, in terms of growing crops of any sort. So they were harrowing with those. Those horse teams were used for taking fencing supplies to replace the fences that were lost during floods and during snowstorms. And to me, that's at Rydal Downs at Oxford, North Canterbury, and near Oxford. And it's very much a land girl experience. Oh.
Dianne, what would the average age be? So they were allowed to join if they were 17?
17.
What would you say the average age would have been?
It depended on their parents. I mean, girls left home, and the parents would put them, or the mother, I guess, the mother usually, because the father would be working somewhere for us. Mother would put them on the train and wouldn't see them for a long time because they didn't know exactly whereabouts they were going to end up. It's all very well putting them on the train for Masterton, for example, but at least two particular girls I know went out to the coast and they didn't get to town for a long time. And so there was no postage at that stage. I mean, there weren't the vehicles to carry on with those things, and you didn't need bread and milk deliveries because people were producing their own. I mean, people on land were amazing subsistence livers. They grew all their own food. So they could have ended up anywhere. And it was, there weren't any telephones out in those days. 2 per mile, that book about putting the telephone in to the isolated areas hadn't been written. And it was difficult. There was a lot of isolation in New Zealand.
So anywhere between 17 and 54 was the range.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd have to say the average would be in the 17, 18, 19 years.
So towards the younger.
Yes. And some of them, at first, when there was they weren't registered, these were just in the Land Corps days, they would be rung, or they'd be an ad in the paper saying, girl wanted for farm work. And so a girl would answer that, and she'd have to do that by writing to the newspaper in those days, and she'd get an answer back. Could you meet me under the clock at such and such railway station. And that's what they would do. And
You wouldn't do that now.
well, no. Does anyone want to talk about how much the girls were endangered by farmers? Right, there's some good stories out there. There are still stories about the land girl who got pregnant, and that happened. They lived in isolated places. Somehow, they lived in close places, but you had these sorts of stories. The farmer would come and put my light out. I slept in the homestead, but out on the veranda. The farmer would come and put my light out. He'd say, "This is the time that light has to be out." And she was treated like, a child. And there was one particular one who used to go in and waken the girl in the morning, and she would immediately leap out of bed because he'd try and get in. And then one day they were having breakfast, and the farmer said to his wife, I think we should move the land girl's bed. Where it is, it's in a draft. Not good for her, it needs to be against the wall." So she packed up immediately and left. She had no more opportunity to leap out of bed. So there was a bit of that. And the girls, by the time they were in the 80s, spoke quite freely about that sort of thing. One person would start, and then they'd all realise, well, they had a story like that too. But they had some very, very happy experiences, and the two major chapters about Rydal Downs and Glenburn, the coastal Glenburn and the Wairarapa, they had wonderful communities of people. Some of the men stayed on. For example, there had to be a blacksmith because they were on horses all the time, no motorbikes, no trucks, etc. And the blacksmith would be there, he'd be looking after those horses. And so you'd have a blacksmith, you'd have a station cook. Inevitably, station cooks, do you know what station cooks are usually guilty of? Alcoholism, for some reason. And the station cooks were not girls. They were kind of men in their 60s. That's what they'd come to do. Not before they were 60, and not long after either, but they were people who sort of got stuck in a rut, weren't particularly interested in cooking, but that was a job, and it was a place to live.
Dianne, this lady here is Margaret, and her sister was one of the land girls, and she might have some stories to tell, because I think you believe she looked very flash in her uniform, didn't you?
Oh yes, we loved her. Well, yes, we were about 10, 11, us three younger ones, and we loved getting dressed up with the great coats that they had. We played all sorts of games in the backyard with her uniform.
Those clothes, those woolen clothes were the most incredible quality that we just don't see now. We don't. They were really special. And the leather boots, superb.
Dianne, how did you come to find all the women? So 220 you interviewed in person. Was it just word of mouth that you were doing this project and people came forward?
There was one amazing woman who'd been a land girl and had some very interesting stories to tell. And she lived up at Wellsford, Northland, and she had tried to connect people. And by the time I came along, she'd probably collected 100 names. And she was still doing it. And so she decided that what would be a good idea would be to sort of go to a centre where there would be some women and have a conference. And so I would go with her, and it was fun and as well, and there were plenty of people I could interview at that time. And they really loved doing it so much that they did it each year for a while. And I would come down here, I picked up a little Edith Carter from Fairley. She was a land girl who was educated in farming by Commander Boyle at Orari. And I drove her to Wanaka. We had a nice time at Wanaka, and then went on to Invercargill. So I interviewed people from Whangarei to Riverton in in Southland, and just about everywhere in between. But one of the things I enjoyed doing was looking up agricultural journals to see where B&Bs were advertised. And so I would write to a B&B saying that I'm working on this project. I would like to come and stay with you anyway, but I would be really interested if, when I'm with you, you might find, or you might have some names of people in your district who had land girls or who were land girls. And I got a lot through that. That was terrific. But really it was searching, yeah. And that's because all of their records were lost. Archives were just not interested. And Nancy Wood, she wrote the book in the New Zealand Second World War series. She was the person who was asked to do women. And I think she probably had a page and a half, and there was nothing really there. But we finally got them, and after some work, 2010 I think, or 2011, they were finally, it was finally agreed by the Returned Servicemen Association that they could, like WACS and RENS and WAFs, be members of RSA. And also we went to the Department of Internal Affairs and said, look, there's no award, there's no badge, there's nothing to show that these women were in the land service and they'd done this work. And so we've got a badge, which was nice, but most of the women didn't, they weren't alive by that time, which was really sad. So I was very regretful that I hadn't got onto this earlier.
How many land girls would have been in New Zealand?
4,200.
Really?
It was the biggest women's service, so it was more than twice as many WACs, and there were very few WAFs. And the girls would be quite sort of funny about these girls, because what they used to do is they used to be drivers, and they used to arrange, they were secretaries of army men. And one girl said, and they were bed warmers. I'm sure they weren't, but they heard stories the way we hear stories.
And they did the real thing by driving the army trucks, and these others were just mucking around with somebody's farmer's husband.
That's right. going for a walk on a hill with a farmer.
Our mother was a land girl, and in the latter part of her life she went to a number of reunions throughout the South Island. Were they connected because of your book being written?
No, well,
I didn't hear about her doing it earlier in her life.
no, I think that Joan Butler, who I talked about, from Warkworth, from one of those towns. What town did I say? Wellsford. Yeah, it was Wellsford. It wasn't, definitely not Warkworth. Warkworth is unrecognisable today as it was in the Second World War. But she was starting to try and get people together. So what was your mother's name? Maiden name?
June Durick.
Oh, yes. Well, there's a photo of her downstairs, isn't there? I've got a photo in the book of her. Yeah, she's lovely. Lovely. She had some good things to say.
From a lawyer's office, so she'd had no experience of the land at all.
No.
But she was either going to go there or to a flax factory, and she didn't want to go to the flax factory.
No, there wasn't really a choice for a girl who had some spirit. The only thing is that, you know, they tried to take one of the dogs because they knew they had to get some dogs, and they weren't the right kind of dogs when they took those to the farm. No, that's useless. You know, you can take that back, you can send that back. Yeah, it was a tough time, but it was good. And every time I'd sit down at someone's home, they would say things like, "Oh, I'll show you my killing knife. I'm still using it." And you know, here is just this one person with this woman, and she'd be brandishing her killing knife, and I'd think, "Oh, I wonder if my husband knew I'd going to this particular place today." And the other thing they used to say was, I used to say, "You have got the most remarkable memory," because they were, you know, at the age where their long-term memories were wonderful. They could remember every detail. Like, you know, we got off a train, we were told, well, we're going to be crutching tomorrow, or whatever it was they were doing. And you know, you were there, you were getting off the train, and they would describe the person who was meeting them. And I said, your memories are wonderful. And they said, well, yes, but if you asked me who I played golf with yesterday, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I'm getting to understand that now.
Dianne, have you, through this process, done any kind of, I don't know, reflecting on the significance of land girls in New Zealand in terms of just the status of women and feminism in this country? Like, have you had any thoughts about their significance in that kind of historical context?
Yes, but I tell you something really sad. When the girls who didn't want to actually leave the farms, and some of them were looking after farms, and the husband, not the husband, just the owner would come back, and they'd say, well, you can go now. And they'd say, well, I've been doing this, that, and blah, blah, and I want to, you know, I've got the stud sheep doing blah, 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 and I've got them, and I like to move them here or there. No, it's all right. And then a husband would come back and say, I want no wife of mine to be seen on a tractor, or no wife of mine would be seen, you know, out on the farm. And they'd gone away with this, well, it was what happened. The women were at home in the shed, I mean in the house, and domestic, and looking after family and hearth. And the men did all the outside work. And I mean, I grew up like that. Except sometimes when we wanted in the wool shed, or when things got really tough.
Even though there was kind of, I guess, tremendous evidence for the fact that these women could do this kind of work.
Yes, but do you know what they thought? I mean, this happened again and again. They would say to me, look, these men have been through a really hard time. Some of them would come home so broken, and they needed a bit of nurturing, they needed psychological support. And if I'm going to be railing against what they want to do in their rehabilitation, it's not going to be nice for them. So they were trapped, really, but they're still very bright and cheerful and chirpy about it. They had good marriages, and a lot of them did not want to go back to town and bought their own farms.
I think what they did, though, if you're thinking about the impact on the longer term, is that they raised stroppy children. They raised stroppy daughters.
Oh, did they?
You know, like, because they... Like
You.
Like us.
You mean like, you know, like widgies and bodgies and, you know, all those things in the 50s and 60s?
That wave of early feminism, although everybody got sent back to the kitchen,
To their roles.
it didn't mean that they didn't take what they'd learned with them.
Yes, I do hospice biographies, and you know, these are people who are terminally ill. It's a voluntary thing that I do, and I often have men who say, it wasn't until I retired that I knew how intelligent my wife was, and what she, and seriously, and what she could do, and what Yeah, and what she could do. And I always assumed that there wasn't, we left in the morning after breakfast and we saw her again at dinner time at night, and we didn't really have anything to do. We didn't know what she was really doing. Women did a great job of supporting men.
We better give you a big round of applause. That was really good.
Well, I hope it didn't sound too biased, but I have a lot of respect for these women. And there are a lot too. And I find when I'm doing hospice biographies, there are a tremendous amount of women. And everybody, male and female, starts with, well, I've just had an ordinary life. And, they don't, we all say that, but, everybody's had an extraordinary life. They've got something different, yeah.